Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Civics classes that have traditionally focused on the three branches of government are increasingly taking stock of the fourth branch, the alphabet soup of independent authorities that do everything from run our trains, build our schools, fix our streets, and maybe build a football stadium on Manhattan's West Side. The traditional view has been that these independent authorities shield critical government functions from the vagaries of politics. A more recent view has seen these authorities as political fiefdoms that shield their internal operations from the oversight and transparency that taxpayers have a right to expect. Comptroller Alan Hevesy, in a 2004 report calling for greater accountability, said a culture of arrogance has arisen with many of the 640 state-sanctioned authorities and their subsidiaries by the end of 2002, which accounted for 90% of all state-supported debt, with the projection that astronomical percentage was edging higher and higher. Here in the city, the picture is much the same. Out of every tax dollar we pay to City Hall, 16 or 17 or 18 cents, heading towards 20 cents, goes to pay off bondholders before the first dime can be spent for a cop, a teacher, a sanitation worker, or a New York professor. Lawmakers in Albany and City Hall have been holding a series of hearings looking into the state of public authorities. We join that debate tonight with four prominent New Yorkers. John Liu is a city councilman from Flushing, Queens, who chairs the council's Transportation Committee. Charles Brescher is Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Independent Citizens Budget Commission. Marcia Van Wagner is the Deputy Comptroller for the Budget in the Office of City Comptroller William Thompson. And Ernest Tollerson is the Senior Vice President for Research and Policy at the New York Partnership. Councilman Liu, let me start with you. You've been holding a series of hearings into the operations of the MTA and the degree to which they operate beyond public scrutiny that you might have in an online city agency. Why should people care about that separation and if the trains run on time?
Well, I think this is the most timely discussion. The fact is that authorities and what they do and how they can do what they do is being called into question more and more by the public as people, rightfully so, demand more accountability from government. And in the past, as you say, the authorities have done a good job of, I suppose, shielding the work of government to a certain extent from politics. But I think we've gone past that time, and it's truly time to bring accountability. And as far as the MTA goes, we're talking about the mother of all authorities. And the MTA clearly needs to be reformed from the bottom up so that the public can get more accountability from this behemoth agency.
Ms. Van Wagner, there's very differences in how authorities operate at the city and the state, and the difference between a capital budget and an expense budget. Give us a 2-minute education.
Sure. The state really has the authority to create authorities. So most of the big authorities, the MTA, the Port Authority, which is a bi-state agency, and other, again, an alphabet soup of agencies, are created by the state. The local governments really are limited to creating local development corporations and sort of similar entities that don't have the kind of powers and scope that the state authorities do. The state has relied on its authorities far more than local governments rely on local development corporations because authorities enable the state to borrow a lot of money without going to the voters. The state's supposed to, the legislature's supposed to go to the voters if they want to issue bonds. It's a very constraining requirement. Voters frequently don't like to vote in favor of bond issuances, so they have this proliferation of authorities to get around that requirement. The local governments don't use them as much for that purpose, although we're seeing some of that starting to bubble up in New York City with, I think, the Hudson Yards and some of the other uses in the city.
Hudson Yards is for the stadium area.
Right, for the West Side. The funding for, you asked me to distinguish between an operating and a capital budget. The capital budget is you have capital projects, and they're primarily financed through issuing debt. And what happens is that then the tax revenues and so forth are used to pay off the debt service on the capital budget, and that becomes part of the operating budget.
So the operating budget pays for the debt service on the capital budget.
That's right.
So even though this money is not being directly coming out of a capital budget, out of the city's operating budget, for instance, we still are paying it. Talk about Is that debt service out of control? I mean, is it destructive,
Yes,
or is it a necessary problem?
The amount that the state, to focus on the state for a minute, is paying in debt service has been sort of growing and in some senses exploding because the authorities have been there as a mechanism for debt. So the state constitution says that if the state is going to borrow money, they're supposed to put that before the voters and can only borrow if the voters say yes for a particular amount for a particular purpose. What's happened is that often the voters have turned that down, but the legislature and the governor want to spend the money anyway. And so they use authorities as a kind of backdoor borrowing. The authorities can borrow when the state can't because they're these separate entities. But the debt still has to be paid back. So what happens is that the state contracts with the authority to pay off the debt service. And this is what's called backdoor borrowing. And now of the $45 billion or so that the state has out in state-supported debt, about 90% of it has been issued through these backdoor mechanisms.
Ernest, give us a political overview of this. I mean, obviously, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, authorities have been able to get things done through looser, kind of more quickly.
Sure.
Than if you had to go through what I might call a normal city agency.
Right, right. Well, Bob, the good news is that economic development in this city and this state throughout the 20th century and even before that has always been a bipartisan issue. I don't care, which party you're enrolled in. You know that you want a vibrant economy, and a vibrant economy needs a certain kind of platform. So when you look at some of the major authorities that you need for economic development, you want those authorities to function properly. You want them to be obviously accountable and transparent, but you want them to do their job. So whether it's moving people to and from work, developing land that's sort of underutilized, you really want authorities that can really position you for economic development for the next 20 to 50 years and really keep the city in the position it's in. So, there's a real incentive to find the problems, but correct them in ways that these authorities can contribute to economic growth.
But in your looking at this question through the partnership, I mean, do you see an accountability problem? Is there a transparency problem?
Sure, and it can, it sort of affects authorities of all sizes. I mean, all authorities aren't equal. I mean, from the smallest IDA to the largest authority you can think of, maybe the Port Authority or the MTA. I mean, they all have procedures and practices they need to tighten up. And obviously, there's been a great deal of discussion of transparency, accountability, being able to read budgets, having independent boards of directors, splitting the office of chairman and CEO where necessary, so that you can have these authorities run in a way that the public has a great deal of confidence in the mission they're carrying out.
Right. Council, I mean, in looking at the West Side train yards and the idea that there's going to be a $1.6 billion development, a $2 billion development, depending on how you look at the proposals that have come in, the $3 billion, whatever that number is. There's a remarkable lack of public oversight of that process. That is being done through Hudson Yards, through the MTA,
right.
And you, as an elected representative of, as the head of the Transportation Committee of the City Council, have very little to say about that.
Well, that's been one of the biggest problems. I completely agree with Ernest here that, if an authority is shielded from politics and is able to make the tough decisions, such as issuing bonds for good projects, raising subway fares, which is never popular no matter where you are or who you are, making those tough decisions shielded from politics, that's a good thing. But when an authority starts to behave in a way that they feel they are above everyone else, that they don't need to answer to anybody, that they don't even need to provide basic information, then that becomes a real problem. And that starts to impede the ability of that authority to carry out its main mission. For example, if you look at what's happened with the West Side Stadium and with regard to the MTA, they have a very valuable property. And it's their fiduciary responsibility to get as much money as possible in the sale of that property. And yet, at the beginning of this process, they were willing to simply give it away to one entity for $100 million, even though the MTA themselves had assessments in value that ranged from $900 million to over $1 billion for that same property. So It's because, in some ways, the competing offer, and some people may disagree with that offer or whatever, but the fact is that the competing offer really opened up the process. And I hope the process will continue to be open. It is incumbent upon the MTA, now that they have received the competing bids as of yesterday, to open up the information. That information needs to become public.
Is there a fiscal price? I'm going to ask you too. Is there a fiscal price for this kind of secrecy?
Well, I think that part of it is striking this balance between giving people the independence to be able to make hard decisions and having things done in sunlight and being fully transparent. And at different times, different agencies are at different points in that balance, and I think on some occasions we've seen authorities where the public has suffered because not enough has been made public. It's not just an MTA issue. There's been a lot of discussion about this going back in previous administrations with respect to some of the IDAs and the economic development deals and what's made public about what kind of tax concessions have been given.
Is an industrial development authority which can, in essence, lend the public's credit to private development. Is that?
Essentially, that's right.
And also give tax breaks. Yeah.
And give tax breaks as part of the deal. And in return, and this I think raises another issue, in return, those entities that borrow money via these IDAs usually agree to pay some kind of payment in lieu of taxes, or what's called a pilot, to the city to pay for the services, even though they're not actually paying sales tax or property tax or whatever. They're paying something because they are users of city services. And those pilot payments have become, again, part of this debate over the West Side financing. Again, when you set up these sort of off-budget entities, you create the opportunity to exploit them in ways that may not necessarily have been intended. And in this case, the mayor's arguing that when the entities pay these pilot payments, that he has the authority to redirect those pilot payments away from the city budget and use it for, what he wants to use it for. And I think it raises a legal question, and also raises the question, if this is what he's saying, then, has this been going on in the past? How much money is out there? There's not really good accounting of these funds. They don't get reported to the Department of Finance when they're collected. They don't get reported to the Comptroller's office. We're doing an audit to try and determine what happens to some of these funds.
I think you're going to see over, I would say, probably in the next year, the public throughout the state will get a lot more clarity on authorities here and throughout the state, because we're going to have a commission, a bipartisan commission, and I think they're going to look at all these issues, and I think they're going to settle some of them, frankly, and come up with, to the degree possible, uniform standards. I mean, your opening, you said that we had something north of 640 authorities. Well, that was the number. I think
that's just in the state.
That's just in the state.
Right.
But since everyone in Albany has started to look at authorities, the count is now up, I think, to something like, when you count all the subsidiaries, up to 730 something. Yes. So clearly, we're still in a fact-finding mode, and we need to know whether we have authorities that, frankly, have maybe outlived their usefulness. They've built the parking lot they were going to build in the suburbs, and you really don't need them anymore, and they don't need to continue to issue new bonds for new debt. You might have other authorities that you want to merge, and you want to sort of, for the different classes of authorities, from the small ones up to the real behemoths, you want to sort of figure out what's the best way to approach transparency and what's the best way to have an audit committee, because it's not going to be the same for every authority. What you want for the MTA and the Port Authority will be a lot different than what you want for a small, tiny IDA somewhere in the state.
You also had the situation with the Erie Canal, where basically, development rights potentially worth multiple millions of dollars were sold for, I think, $30,000 in what appeared to be, and what the state comptroller at least has called a sweetheart deal. And you have similar arguments concerning some of the IDA borrowing, even in the city, towards favored developers. And when I was a reporter, we would question these things. We would say that this is proprietary information. We would argue, well, it's a public agency. How can you have proprietary information when you're in a public agency?
And I think, Ernest, I think you're right in the sense that obviously the Port Authority and the MTA are very different entities from some little whatever that bridge authority or whatever it is.
The St. Lawrence.
Well, there's another one. I can't remember the name of it. But anyway. But I think, fundamentally, we do want the same things from all of these authorities, which is transparency and accountability, and those are, that's really you know, if you want to police these agencies or restrict them, I think the maximum amount of transparency becomes the way of, you know, once you're able to once you have fully open books and the public can see what's going on in authorities, that in itself becomes a way that constrains the activity of these authorities, that
as
keeps
well as
them
having
from acting. And,
independent,
you know,
well-trained directors
yeah,
serving.
well, right.
It may be possible that this concept of independent authority may have outlived its usefulness. I think many of these large agencies that were created decades ago they were created during a time when government, quite frankly, operated very, very differently than what government operates as today. I think in government, particularly with elective offices, there is a great deal more accountability. The disclosure requirements, the walls that have been set up between different agencies and different branches of government, I think all of those have lent a great deal more accountability to public officials, especially elected officials. And given that, I think that many of the original purposes that authorities were created under probably have outlived their usefulness. And I for one, would be, you take the MTA or Port Authority or some of the there are other large agencies, authorities throughout the state.
The dormitory authority being the mother of all agencies on its purely
Borrowing
state
point.
level.
That's right.
In terms of borrowing.
Some of these should, in my opinion, should become either state or city agencies that are directly budgeted by the legislative bodies at those respective levels, and therefore having full accountability to those elected officials, and those elected officials having full accountability to the people that elect them.
Part of it, though, is when I remember during the Giuliani administration when they created the Transitional
Finance
Authority, in large part because the city had bumped up against the cap. There's a limit to how much, and again, you have different systems in the city and the state, but the city's ability to borrow money is limited by the total value, as a percentage of the total value of property in the city. And when you kind of bumped up against that, they just created a new authority to issue more debt. On the other hand, on the state level, where to turn these things into a state agency, when you have a constitutional requirement to go to the voters for bonding. I mean, right now they're looking for a $2.9 billion bond for transportation. I think 1.6 billion of that would go to the MTA. When you have to go to the voters for all this stuff, and you're going to have a hard time getting it passed. So you have
But that's exactly
whole
the
range
point. If an authority is created simply so that you don't have to go and be accountable to the voters, or so that you can subvert some kind of a mechanism in terms of a debt ceiling that was enacted years ago, then there's a problem with creating that authority. If an authority was created, as I believe some of them were, including the MTA, created for the purpose of making difficult decisions that would have to be made, but you don't want to subject them to the political process. As long as that authority or that agency stayed transparent and people could understand how they worked and how they made their decisions, then fine. But if you're going to create an authority to subvert what had already been set up previously as reasonable limits, then that's very problematic.
I think realistically, we're not going to be able to solve the authority problem until we change the provisions about debt in the state. And part of what the controllers proposed is a constitutional amendment. But we need a different debt limit. The one we have doesn't work. It's unrealistic. And there ought to be a process to limit debt that gives us the ability to raise money to do important capital investments, but doesn't have to rely on these backdoor mechanisms.
Ernest, you talked about directors.
Sure.
The memberships of the boards of these authorities, ostensibly supposed to be somewhat independent overseers of these authorities, but in fact, again, I don't mean to pick on Mayor Giuliani. At the MTA in particular, it was his staff that he assigned to sit on the MTA board, where he obviously had direct control over those people. To some degree, also in the Health and Hospitals Corporation, it was people who depended on him for their paychecks.
Right. And I don't think that's unique to any one mayor. I think you could go back and look at any number of mayors who might take the same approach to certain agencies. No, I think the important thing is that we're in a kind of Sarbanes-Oxley environment where both in the public sector and the private sector, you want transparency, you want accountability, and that means having really qualified, independent directors. You want to appoint people who really know that particular authority and know its business and can serve on an audit committee. And that's really important. And it's not a place to reward relatives or political contributors or supporters. You want talented people, and that can sometimes be hard to find.
Do you have the comptroller has appointees to a number of these, not to the MTA, I don't think, but he has appointees to a number of boards. Is it also a situation where he would appoint staff members to these boards?
In some cases, there are staff members in the boards. I mean, you know, again, it's only one member of a larger board,
Right.
so we don't have the same amount of control that the mayoral appointees might have if he has multiple appointees.
Well, I
in
mean, because
particular.
I remember I used to cover boards like the Franchise Review Commission. These are fairly obscure boards which actually have a lot of power. And the mayor had 4 votes, and everybody else had, well, combined, had like 3 votes or something. And it was like the form of an authority, but it was essentially a mayoral agency, even though it lived outside. And this is not an authority. This is kind of a a governing board. But even at the MTA, essentially, it's a joint board between the mayor and the governor.
Well, you're reaching the issue of should someone serve at the pleasure of a political official, a governor or a mayor? Should they have a fixed term? I mean, these are all things that, again, I think once we have this state-level bipartisan commission made up of the private sector, the governor's appointees, one by Controller Hevesy, and all the other major players in Albany, they're going to work through all these issues. And some of the answers will be, I think, different for different size authorities. And one authority, in fact, we have not talked about is the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, where one could argue that in a lot of ways that development corporation, I think, has tried hard to function both as an authority, but also with a great deal of democracy and input from people in New York.
Well, there are other people who would argue otherwise.
I know, but I'm saying when you look at the range of authorities that, as New Yorkers, we deal with, that's certainly one authority that I think has made some effort to really, not patronize the public.
I think that is perhaps better said of newer authorities or authorities that haven't been around for quite that long. But once you get an authority that has just been around for a very long time, it's almost
Do you have one in mind?
It's almost natural that they become less accountable because they don't have the kinds of pressures. I mean, pressure equals accountability. If you try to take pressure away, you're inevitably at some point going to remove the accountability.
Well, let's
But there is
take
pressure
one.
because, as the councilman knows, you take up a large authority like the Port Authority. Essentially, the governors of the 2 states have a great deal to say about those authorities. They can sign or veto minutes. And I think actually, that's even true of some of the other larger authorities around. So I think, there is that.
But the Port Authority is a very good example. First of all, because it's such a powerful authority. It's a federally created authority because
Right.
it's a 2-state economy.
Right.
2-state authorities. It's a little bit unique. But it was formed, in 1923 for the purpose of building a rail tunnel under
Right.
New York Harbor, between New York City, basically between Brooklyn and New Jersey. We are still waiting, 82 years later. It's still on the agenda, God bless Jerry Nadler.
But
we're still on the agenda to build that.
If you actually go back, and I can't recall all the words, and read the mission of the Port Authority, it was written in a broad way so that the Port Authority could take on projects that were sort of good for the economy of the bi-state region and not sort of get locked in only to transportation projects. And it turned out that when you write the charter of a major authority broadly enough, it allows you to respond to the needs of the day over the next 50 years.
Well, it also allows you, in the case of the dormitory authority, I don't mean to be playing devil's advocate here, but of course I do. But in the case of the dormitory authority, they lend for hospitals, they lend for colleges, they lend for all kinds of development.
Right.
I mean, I don't mean to be hung up on the name dormitory in the name, but has this become like its own pot of money, its own slush fund?
Well, it's really, it's kind of different in a way when you think about authorities, because there's authority debt that is what I was describing, which is really the state's debt that they do for them. There's the authority's debt that's really their debt in the sense of the MTA, where they're issuing debt to build projects for themselves. And then there's this other thing called conduit debt, which is when we use a public entity to borrow on behalf of a private organization. So the Dormitory Authority borrows for New York University and Columbia University and CUNY and is paid back by them. And what they're doing is lending their sort of standing as well as the tax-exempt status to this, but it's not adding to the taxpayer's burden. It's still a liability of NYU or Mount Sinai Hospital. or whatever.
But do state taxpayers, if they default on those bonds, is the full faith and credit of the state behind those bonds?
No. There is a sort of a reality check about would the state step in to do something. Legally, they're not obligated to.
But could the state, because the government runs on bonds. I mean, the government, if you take away every bond point, every bond rating that goes down costs us untold millions of dollars. In a change in the interest rate means that we have to pay bondholders a lot more money every month, and so. I can't imagine that even if NYU, let's say, was going to default, that the state wouldn't step in and protect its bond rating. There's something larger at stake than just the amount of money that it's lending.
Right. I think the question, it's a good question. I think nobody really knows the answer to it. I mean, clearly, there's no legal obligation for the state to do anything about this debt if there's a problem with it. But then there's a kind of, is there a guilt by association out in the bond market that if it's issued by the state authority and an entity defaults, does that kind of spill over on the actual true government debt in the state?
I think it's more of a question in the Industrial Development Authority where you're lending the city's credit for private development. I mean, NYU and Columbia are kind of mammoth
that's exactly
institutions.
what happens. I mean, even though there may not be a legal obligation for the state to take over the defaulted debt, I think there's an implied, and in the market, that implication is reflected in the better financing rates that you get when you go through these agencies than if you just went through a private bank.
Well, I say with the where it's private entities, what is happening is that the government is bestowing the tax-exempt status on many of these bonds, and the private entity enjoys a lower interest rate because the bonds are tax-exempt. But there's not a legal obligation on the government to pay. It's really another way of giving them some incentive to locate where they presumably wouldn't otherwise.
But could you imagine a situation in which the government would allow IDA bonds are still city bonds?
They're IDA bonds.
But they are right. But they are bonds issued presumably based on the creditworthiness of the city.
No, there is no obligation for the city to make good on it. Now,
No
again,
legal
the reality,
obligation.
that's right,
Right.
no legal or moral in the way we used to use that term.
It's a similar situation to the Dormitory Authority, that there's really no legal obligation of government to step in and do anything about bonds if they default, but then the sort of dangling question is whether, A, would they, if worse came to worse, and B, if they didn't, would there be some kind of, unpleasant side effect in terms of the city or state's own bonds? I don't really know.
And in fact, the city in the 1970s came very close to default, being unable to pay its bondholders, to pay its own general obligation bondholders. And again, remember, general obligations are voted by the council and issued by the city, as opposed
And accountable to voters.
And accountable to voters, as opposed to this kind of authority debt, which is basically based on dedicated revenue streams, generally to pay them back. It's a little technical, but this is awfully important that you all are going to be paying bonds that are issued today for the next 30 years or some inordinate amount of time.
And paying higher subway fares to pay off those bonds.
Right.
Although you made the point. This is an important point. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You're an elected official.
Right.
Would you want to face a vote, even if you believe that subway fares needed to be raised to raise revenue? Would you want to face that vote?
Well, as I said, if a public authority is created to allow government to make some of the very difficult decisions, that's fine as long as they keep their operations transparent, which has not been the case of many of the large authorities throughout the state. And to build on what Ernest said before, the Port Authority, I think, works well relatively because you have complete control split among two governors. Right. In the case of other authorities just within New York State, you have diluted appointments, but still dominated by the governor. And so when people ask me if the MTA is accountable, yes, the MTA is largely accountable to the governor of the state, accountable to no one else, but accountable to the governor of this state. And even worse than operations that have ceased to become transparent, when authorities become part of a political agenda, that is time to just cut that authority short, and that we have seen in too many instances over just these past couple of years.
I'm going to start taking some questions. Tell us your name, tell us the campus, and speak up, please.
Hi, my name is Gus Weinstein. I'm from Brooklyn College. My question is, what do you make of the idea of using the high-rise elevated tracks, the century-old weed-overgrown tracks on the site of the proposed West Side Stadium, the idea that's come up of transforming them into an elevated public park?
Kind of a policy question as opposed to an authority question.
Well, as a matter of fact, the old High Line on the lower west side is being turned into a park. I forget how many acres this park would be, but this is an old elevated railroad track that has since become so overgrown with weeds that they're going to turn it into a park. And I think that's a fine use for that. I can't even call it a location. It's a facility.
Right.
As far as the west side,
adaptive reuse.
right. So I mean, I think that's fine, and I think there's a lot of community support for it. It's not going to cost the state or the city a whole lot of money, so it's a perfect example of something that has become outmoded, but yet is able to be transformed into something that's usable by the community.
In terms of being usable by the community had little to say about, I mean, they had a lot to say, but not too many people were listening to them, about how those rail yards were going to be used. I mean, should the community have had more direct influence in what happened, or because NIMBY, not in my backyard, is a very prominent impulse among political,
Right.
in the political universe? I mean, does it make sense that you would try to keep that development out of the hands of community and politicians?
I think the community, the immediately surrounding community around the west side, the Hudson Yards area, they have had a great deal of input in terms of being vocal publicly. But the problem here is that this is a project that really affects the city, the region as a whole, and it should never have been taken completely out of the legislative process, which this administration has tried at every turn to do. It should be part of the legislative process because it's so important. The legislative process is a part of how government is supposed to work. There are supposed to be checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch.
I think on the zoning side, though, the rezoning of the Hudson Yards part of this did go through the regular process.
Yes.
And was in fact approved by the City Council.
Yes, sir.
My name is Scott Stewart. I'm from BMCC. My question is the appointees to the board of directors for MTA or for other agencies. I believe isn't it lopsided for the state that the governor has a larger amount of appointees to the board of directors than the city does, and how does that relate to the agenda of the city riders being addressed more than that of the suburban riders coming into the city?
Well, I mean, you have one system in the metropolitan, which includes the Transit Authority, includes the Long Island Railroad, and includes the Metro North Railroad, and includes the bridges and tunnels that the old Robert Moses built bridges and tunnels that connect the boroughs. And the argument has been that that because of the political makeup of that board, and because of the political makeup of who chairs the Transportation Committee in the Republican State Senate, which means people in the suburbs, that transit riders in the city get shortchanged. Do you guys think that this is somehow connected to the structure of the authority?
Well, I think the good side of the structure of the authority is that when we created this, the intention was to make it a state responsibility. Part of this was to shift the onus for having to pay for all the transportation services in the region from the city to a statewide or at least a regional base. And I think the fair quid pro quo for that was that the governor got more of a political say, but he then bears the responsibility. Right. So if the MTA starts to go down the tube, as they say, he's the one we should be pointing to and saying, you ought to be putting up the capital money. And I think he's got the political clout, but he also has the fiscal responsibility.
But again, structurally, because of the state constitutional problem than having to go to the voters to issue debt, can he put up the capital money?
Well, you know, the MTA can issue their own debt backed by their own fare revenue or other pledged revenue, again, from the legislature. There are dedicated taxes that it has that the state has supplied. So
It can do that on its own.
Well, the legislature has to dedicate the taxes, but once they're there, they decide how to use them.
So the question is whether again, this is the difference between the operating and the capital. If in order to issue the debt, the MTA needs some source of revenue to pay for it, and you know, short of putting it entirely on the fares, which would make for very high fares, there needs to be some kind of subsidy to pay for that, and that's where, you know, it has to really be the governor's decision to step up to the plate on that front.
I'm sorry, and shielding this process from politics is not the same as saying you're going to take politics out of it.
Right. And we all know at the
Right.
moment, I mean, we're facing a very difficult problem. The MTA has a new 5-year capital plan to fund. A large part of that program is at least, what is it, $17.2 billion, just for basic normal replacement, state of good repair. That's very important to sort of get that done and fund that, and it's not funded yet.
And not only that, the governor, who has the most clout over the MTA, I would say near total control over the MTA, has proposed a budget that is short of this bare bones budget. It's $2.5 billion short of that budget, and doesn't even include ways to fund the $14.7 billion. Whereas the chairman of the MTA actually did come up with something very good, and a $17.2 billion plan that is funded with new initiatives that would have to be passed by the state legislature. But really, I think if you look at, you know, I totally agree. The mass transit in the metro area should not stop at the borders of the 5 boroughs. It's a regional issue, and so it should be taken up by the state. The state should have more appointees. The governor should have more appointees. But at the same time, we need to see that money coming down from the state government as well. And over the last 10 years, the capital funding has basically trickled to a big fat zero for the MTA, so that new debt that's being issued by the MTA is being borne completely by the operating expenses of the MTA, therefore necessitating higher and higher fares. And we will see more fare increases in the near future if the state does not start to come through once again with capital funding.
You can pay me now or you can pay me later.
Well, a lot of times they basically made deals. They went ahead and spent the money, and now we're starting to see the bills appear.
Yes, sir.
I am Jason Schaff from Brooklyn College. In January, there was a fire at Chambers Street involving the signal routers, and disrupted the A&C line for estimates as long as 3 to 5 years. This was an area that should have been...
Or 3 weeks, as it turns out. Right.
This was an area that should have been a lot more secure than it actually was. Should the NTA spend more money to secure stations, like have someone there like 24 hours a day, and also on platforms?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, but that's
It's common sense. I mean, they didn't. The MTA issued a report 6 years ago saying that these 198 relay rooms need to be fireproofed. And yet, when this thing happened in January, 40 of these relay rooms still remain unfireproofed. You know how the relay room at Chambers Street caught on fire? There was a fire outside the relay room. The fire spread to one of the wires leading into the relay room. The wire, this insulation around the wire was so old that it caught fire. And it brought the fire right into the relay room. It was almost like a fuse. And so that's the kind of lack of maintenance and basic upgrades that the MTA has neglected to take care of. And now we're seeing not only the problem with the A&C fire, the 4, 5, 6 lines shut down last Wednesday. The 7 trains shut down last Thursday. This morning's fiasco in Brooklyn. It's all connected. These are not random incidents. These are predictable results from a decade of neglect of capital funding for the MTA.
But this is an example in which, is it a lack of political will? Have they been shortchanged? Could they have done better? Is the fact that the state controls it mean that we get short shrift? Or was it just a function of the age of the system?
It is, in my opinion. I don't want to hog up too much time here. Very quickly, partly mismanagement and wrongful priorities set by the MTA. But to some extent, the MTA has their hands tied also, because we do have a governor who, from the very beginning of his tenure, made it a stated policy to start eliminating public funding for mass transit. This is not, and I don't think it's a lack of political will. It's not a political mistake that he made. It's actually, you know, he goes upstate talking in all parts of upstate how the state is now saving money by not having to fund New York City's mass transit system. But meanwhile, of course, that doesn't do us well here in New York City.
Yes, sir.
How are you? My name is Ryan Merlin from Brooklyn College. Since, as you were saying earlier, it looks as if the West Side Project is being completely taken out of the hands of the legislature, the city, and the state governments. What's going to happen if that project is completed and there are transparency issues and there are issues with funding and spending of the land and usage of the land? What roles will the city and state governments have?
Well, that's a good question. You know, if the governance issues that Ernest has been talking about really go through, then presumably whatever the Hudson Yards Infrastructure Corporation and whatever other entities are involved with this would be required to at least, you know, conform to the standards of transparency and accountability that are set for other entities. But in terms of making policy decisions about the use of the resources in the Hudson Yards and other things, I think it's an open question about how much input people will have.
Should people have more input? I mean, do you believe that higher levels of input / accountability would improve the fiscal performance of these agencies?
Yes, I think certainly you want to know, you want the people who are putting up the money or who should be getting the money to know who's responsible for this. There should be clear lines of responsibility. Where it's an authority, if it's going to be one that the mayor controls, we should all know that. And you want the transparency. You want to know what's going on. So I think the general effort to promote those values across all authorities ought to be applicable to these new entities if they're created to develop the West Side.
Absolutely. And can you use city bonds to hire a field goal kicker for the Jets if you do that at the stadium? I don't know if you can do that.
Only if he's really good.
Well, they need work. Yes, yes, sir.
My name is Scott Stewart from Burr Manhattan Community College. I was recently reading in New York Magazine, New York Magazine, they were talking about the MTA system, and they painted this bad picture. But what I want to address is that they alluded to some public transportation systems in, say, Paris and some other things, and improvements that would decrease the overhead, like glass partitions on the platform that separate it from the track, so that would eliminate trash. And why is it that the MTA is more reactive? I believe you alluded to that before. It's more reactive and almost complacent in, you know, the condition that it remains, as opposed to going, you know, leaping forward and trying to make advancements in the system.
Rather than being proactive, the MTA has literally for this past week been putting out fires, one after another, and I think that you bring up a very good point. The MTA often does compare itself in New York City to the transit systems of other cities. They love comparing themselves to Washington, to Paris, to London, and they often talk about the advances there that we should have here in New York City. And so rather than looking at some more basic common sense measures like creating some kind of system in which trash is less easily, it gets on the tracks less easily, or even installing public service announcements where people can actually understand the messages that are coming across. They want to compare themselves to Paris by installing this computer-controlled, radio-controlled subway train. And they're about to start that this summer on the L train between Manhattan and Brooklyn. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. I have questioned many times, is that the right choice right now, given all the mishaps that we see in the subway system? Is the MTA really ready to have computers drive subway trains? And I submit to you that now is not the right time. They have more basic things to take care of first.
I was just, I think I have a somewhat different take on that, because to me, what we were talking about before and the failures in the signaling system and the fires, without minimizing the importance of security, it's really much more a matter of failure to modernize. And the communication and signaling system is probably a place where I think they made a strategic mistake not by investing sooner. And I think there could be a lot of payoff from investing in that kind of technology, both in reducing the maintenance costs of it, and if you had a better communication system and you put it in quicker, there's savings, not just that you might need fewer personnel, but you could run trains closer together because the communication is better. And that increases the capacity of the system in rush hour, reduces crowding without having to build new subways. So there's tremendous payoff if they use technology better, and I think the signaling and communication systems is one place where we really could get a payoff if we went after it aggressively.
I absolutely agree with that. I think no one would argue that we need to modernize and make the system more efficient and be able to carry more passengers per unit of time. I think, though, that with the computer-based control, computer-based train control system that they're implementing this summer, we have two issues here. You're absolutely right. The signal system does need to be modernized. It needs to be brought up to 20th century standards, even though we're in the 21st century now. But they're going the next step and spending a great deal more money than is necessary, bringing these trains that are computer-driven, radio control. That's a step that should be saved for later on, after we've actually been able to modernize the signal system of the entire subway system. It's just an example of misplaced priorities, in my opinion.
Hi, Gus Weinstein, Brooklyn College. I just wanted to respond to what you just said about the trains. What immediately came into my head when you started mentioning the L trains and how that would be the train that would receive this technology is that I know that the trains that run on the L line are the most advanced in the subway system, the entire subway system. So why aren't we putting, what I would think is, why aren't we putting more energy and money towards the subway lines that need it the most?
Well, very quickly. I mean, if any train should get that kind of system first, it probably should be the L. Mm-hmm. The reason they picked it is that it's really just one line. There aren't any other tracks merging into that, so you don't have potential errors that might happen. So I mean, it's just a very simple reason. It's just kind of like a standalone track, the L train.
Of course, I rode the L train when I went to high school, but we called it the Canarsie line. So, we're talking, when we talk about backdoor borrowing, you talk about conduit borrowing, we're talking about ways in which taxpayers are impacted. Taxpayers have to foot the bills without having a say in how this money is, let's say, in how... How do you see the future developing? I mean, do you have some sense of what you see specifically coming out of this whole debate that's going on over authorities? Well, I mean, do you have some sense of what the system might look like in 5 years?
Well, I would hope that one key element of it would be, what I was referred to earlier, is a change in the constitutional provisions about how the state can borrow. We shouldn't be relying, we shouldn't have a law that says you have to go to the voters every time you want to raise some money. I mean, the simple political fact is you'll never get a bond issue approved for prisons, but we're going to have prisons, and we've got to operate them humanely. So there should be a mechanism that doesn't require going to the back door, but has some limit on how much it is. Because right now we invented the back door and we just push everything through it.
But in that kind of a system, you would be looking more at a geo system that the city has, where the legislators themselves could approve it and be accountable for the.
Well, I think there would be some externally imposed limit, and then the legislature, together with the governor, would decide how to use the credit that's available under that limit.
Same kind of question to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that sounds reasonable, but I don't want to imply that transparency is a panacea for the troubles that plague the authorities and so forth. But I think it's critically important that people can see what's going on in these agencies, and I think it really does act as a check on the activities of those agencies if people can understand exactly how money is being spent and how decisions, what the consequences are of decisions that are being made. And I really think that 5 years down the road, I mean, I do think that the current efforts to enforce a system of transparency and accountability on these entities is going to be successful, and that 5 years down the road that will result in more streamlined authorities where there's a lot less shenanigans going on and a lot less of the kind of cronyism and, you know, Erie Canal bidding situations, that kind of stuff. I think will be, you know, seriously minimized by these efforts.
I mean, you and I have been covering the city for a long time when we were back in the news business.
Sure.
And it was the creation of something like the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which was an authority, in essence, that issued bonds and took the city's sales tax in order to pay them off, that held the city's head above water, that kept us from absolutely sinking into the
And
mud.
also the pension funds of the unions here also, you know, participated in that
But
as
those
well.
are pension funds,
Yeah.
but those are at least somewhat independent
But
of
I guess
government.
you know, the interesting thing about your example of the creation of MAC to get the city through that difficult period, 75 until the early 80s, is that this is a region in the city that's always been able to innovate. And we just have to have more of that. We have to have a lot more of that. And we're going to have to think about creative ways to create new revenue streams that support the very basic services we need to have the kind of economy that we have. You know, we want an economy that's strong on public education, higher education. We want to be strong in life sciences. Everyone believes that life sciences is really the engine of this century. So that means if we want to be a hub for that, we've got to have really, really first-rate public goods, and it means...
And you have to, and the point, I think you used the word in terms of the MTA, you have to invest.
You have to invest, and it means modernizing in the way the councilman's been talking, but it also means once you come up with a sort of stable budget for maintenance and say to go repair, you've also got to think about expansion. And frankly, other cities around the world, whether you're looking at Paris or Japan, cities all over Japan, are way ahead of us in constantly building and expanding their systems. We're behind, and we have to get back into a phase of actually expanding in a way that promotes economic development.
Would you be comfortable as an elected official making a decision to issue more debt and put more money on, you know, on these people and my kids to pay debt? I mean, should that fall on your shoulders?
Well, that depends on what the debt is for. For example, 10 months into my tenure as a member of the City Council, I was faced with a decision on whether to vote for a very large increase in property taxes in this city. And, you know, I prefer to do that than to have the city issue more and more debt and pass the burden on to future generations. But if it's something that would be absolutely critical to staving off bankruptcy for the city of New York, that's probably a decision I would make. If it was to go and issue bonds to hire the best darn field goal kicker that we could have, then I would probably vote no. So you couldn't really ask any elected official as a blanket statement.
What if the stadium was in Flushing? Would you still want a good field goal kicker? I'm sorry.
I would want a good field goal kicker. I may not want to borrow money to pay him.
Talk about Mac. Talk about the degree to which, in an emergency, and Mac was sort of a one-man operation.
Right.
I mean, it was Felix Rowan, who was, it was more than one man, but he was totally the kind of soul of that. I mean, he basically oversaw that, and his word was kind of gospel.
Yeah, and he could do it because the governor, Hugh Carey, gave him that authority, really, and had the confidence in him. And I think the important thing to note about Mac and this whole city-state relationship is that it really was the state stepping in to bail out the city. And it was a time when that was necessary. The city leadership was not addressing the problem adequately. And it became a mechanism for the state to help out the city. And it was good inventiveness at that time. But I'm not sure we're not in that situation now. We don't need authorities like that now.
Well, go ahead.
Well, and I should also like to contrast MAC with some of the other authority problems we're talking about now. MAC did its job, and then it, you know,
Went out of
just
existence.
went out of existence. Well, that's a
still
whole
here,
other
but-
story. But it didn't become a vehicle for, you know,
Other things.
nonsense,
Yeah.
right? It really, I think it's what you would want from an entity like that. It's sort of a, you know, had a really positive, played a positive
But you
role.
also, for instance, look at
and-
this. I mean, look at the School Construction Authority, which was set up to kind of take the we only have a couple of minutes left to take some of the politics out of school construction and became totally embroiled in politics. And the city seems to be moving away from the School Construction Authority and now as a vehicle to do some of the schools. I mean, so.
Well, that also has to do with this shifting, you know, authority over the school system, and I mean, it's a sort of a complicated,
Well, it was,
issue. And,
Right.
and
during the Giuliani administration, there's a man named Edward Kostikian, who was a former top official. I guess was I can't remember. Was he in Koch or Lindsay? I can't even remember. And
What?
who was called in? You had a situation in which people were. There was a sense that Giuliani said, if I like the issue, I want an authority, because I don't want anybody to stick their nose in my business. If I don't like the issue that this authority is doing, I want to abolish the authority. And Eddie Kostikian, which I thought was a very mature point of view, said every 40 years you have to reform the reforms. That there's a, you know, the way
cycle.
that Big Mac was willing to go out of business was kind of a very mature. You know, and I thought that was, you know, it was not very ideological, but I thought it was very wise on Eddie's part.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that's
I think one of the things that folks hope that this bipartisan commission will do is take a really hard look at these, you know, 700 odd authorities and,
Well, let me-
decide which.
I've gotten the goodbye sign.
You've gotten the goodbye
I
sign.
told you I never make deadline at the end, and I want to thank everybody, and we will see you next month.
This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you.